You know that feeling when you're being watched? The eerie sensation crawling up your spine, even though there's nothing there. Or so you think. That's exactly what I felt on that night. The night I made the biggest mistake of my life, going into the forbidden woods alone. But before I tell you what happened, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you knew you were making a terrible decision, but for some reason, you just couldn't stop yourself? Like some invisible force was pushing you towards disaster? That's what happened to me. And trust me, it's not something you want to experience. I grew up in a small town on the edge of the forest. Everyone knew the stories about the forbidden woods. People talked about strange sounds, shadows that moved when no one was there, and even whispered about disappearances. But, you know, small towns. There's always some urban legend that everyone believes in. I didn't. My friends Eric and Jake didn't either. We were the skeptical ones, the type who thought we were too smart to believe in such nonsense. One evening we were hanging out at Eric's place. It was a Friday, late October, and the air was cold enough to see your breath. We were bored, and Jake, being the daredevil he was, suddenly said, "Why don't we check out the forbidden woods? Come on, it'll be fun. You're not scared, are you, Mark?" He smirked, as if daring me to say no. I laughed, scared of some trees and old ghost stories, please. But deep down, I had this nagging feeling. Something wasn't right, but I ignored it. We grabbed our flashlights, hopped into Eric's truck, and headed toward the edge of the forest. The moon was full, shining a pale light on the trees as they swayed in the cold wind. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Too quiet. We parked at the edge of the woods, right where the town ended, and the wilderness began. Jake was the first to step out, excitement written all over his face. Eric followed, but I hesitated for a second. I don't know why. Maybe I was just nervous, but I shrugged it off and got out. The first thing I noticed when we entered the woods was the air. It was heavy, almost suffocating, like the trees were pressing in on us. And then there was this weird smell, like something rotting. "What's that smell?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shaky. Jake shrugged, already walking ahead. "It's a forest, dude. Probably just some dead animal. You're not chickening out, are you?" I forced a laugh and followed him, but every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into a trap. The deeper we went, the more I regretted coming. There was this strange sound. Not quite wind, but something else. It was like whispers, faint and distant, but they were getting louder. Eric stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight into the distance. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I froze. The whispers. They weren't distant anymore. They were right around us. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Just trees, shadows, and that awful smell. "Let's go back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, my heart was racing. I could feel something watching us, something hidden in the darkness. "Come on, man. We just got here," Jake scoffed. "There's nothing out here but your imagination." He started walking ahead again, but Eric stayed put, looking uneasy. That's when it happened. A loud crack, like a tree branch snapping, echoed through the forest. We all jumped. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something. Something tall, thin, and moving between the trees. "What the hell was that?" Eric whispered, his face pale. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, but even he didn't sound so sure anymore. I felt it again, the heavy air, the whispers, but now it was worse. It felt like the forest was alive, watching, waiting. I grabbed Eric's arm. "We need to leave, now." But before he could respond, Jake let out a laugh, "Oh, come on. You guys are acting like children. It's just a bunch of..." And then he stopped. The laughter died in his throat as he stared into the darkness ahead of us. Did you see that?" His voice was low, trembling. "See what?" Eric asked, stepping closer. There was something. It moved. Over there." Jake pointed with his flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing but more trees. That's when the whispers came back, louder this time. They weren't distant anymore. They were all around us like a chorus of voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My skin crawled, and my heart pounded in my chest. "We need to get out of here," I said, backing up. But Jake wasn't listening. He was staring, frozen, at something in the distance. "Jake, let's go," I shouted, but Eric grabbed his arm. "Jake, what the hell, man? Let's move." But Jake didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on something none of us could see. And then he smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was wrong, twisted. "They're calling me," he whispered, his voice hollow, like someone else was speaking through him. "Who's calling you?" Eric shouted, shaking him. But Jake didn't respond. He just started walking forward, deeper into the woods. "Jake, stop!" I yelled, but he didn't. He just kept walking, like he was in some kind of trance. Eric and I ran after him, but the forest, it felt like it was changing. The trees were closer together. The path we'd come from was gone, and the whispers, they were so loud now, like a deafening roar in my ears. I could barely think. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead of Jake. Tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it wasn't human. "Jake, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. The figure reached out, and just like that, Jake was gone. 1 second he was there, the next, nothing. Just silence. No whispers, no Jake, nothing. Eric and I stood there, frozen, our minds struggling to process what had just happened. 1 minute we were 3 friends exploring a stupid forest, and the next, we were 2. And whatever took Jake was still out there, watching us. Now I have a question for you watching this. What do you think happened to Jake? And have you ever felt that creepy sensation, like something is watching you when you're completely alone? Let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the story so far. You won't want to miss what happens next. It only gets darker from here. Eric and I just stood there, our breaths shallow, our minds racing. For a moment it felt like the world had stopped. Jake was gone. Just gone. 1 second he was walking in front of us, and the next, swallowed by the shadows of the forbidden woods. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. "Mark, we need to go. Now." Eric's voice trembled, and for the first time I saw pure fear in his eyes. This was the guy who never believed in anything supernatural, who always had a logical explanation for everything. But now he was terrified. I didn't argue. I couldn't. My legs felt like jelly, but somehow I forced them to move. We turned and started running back the way we came, but the problem was, we didn't know where back was anymore. The trees all looked the same. The path was gone, and it felt like the forest was shifting around us. "Where the hell is the truck?" Eric whispered, shining his flashlight in every direction, but it was no use. The beam of light just disappeared into the darkness. "It was right here," I said, my voice shaking. But it wasn't. There was no sign of the truck, no sign of the clearing, just endless trees and shadows. The whispers had stopped, but that didn't make it any better. In fact, the silence was even worse. "Mark, I don't think we're alone." Eric's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't need him to tell me that. I could feel it. The same sensation I had when we first stepped into the woods, the feeling of being watched. But now it was stronger, like whatever was out there, whatever took Jake, was circling us, waiting. "We need to stick together," I said, trying to keep calm. "We'll find the truck. We just need to keep moving." But as we walked, it felt like we were going in circles. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist into something unnatural. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. No, someone, standing between the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, stopping dead in my tracks. Eric nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I saw it. But when we shone our flashlights, there was nothing. Just darkness." "What the hell is going on?" Eric whispered, panic rising in his voice. "This doesn't make any sense." I didn't have an answer. Nothing made sense. We had been walking for what felt like hours, but we weren't getting anywhere. It was like the woods were keeping us trapped, spinning us in circles. And all the while, I could feel it. The presence of something ancient, something evil. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped. It was already cold, but now it felt like we had stepped into a freezer. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see Eric shivering beside me. "We need to move," I said, but my voice barely came out. It was like the cold was sucking the energy out of me. Eric didn't argue. We kept walking, but the cold kept getting worse. My fingers were numb, and I could feel my body starting to slow down. Every step felt like I was wading through snow, even though the ground beneath us was dry. And then we heard it. A voice. Not a whisper this time, but a clear, distinct voice. "Mark." I froze. It was Jake's voice. But it couldn't be. Jake was gone. We saw him disappear, and yet the voice was unmistakable. "Mark, come here." Eric's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. It's Jake, but it can't be," Eric said, shaking his head. "It's a trick. Whatever's out there is messing with us." But the voice kept calling, "Mark, over here." And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just ahead, barely visible through the trees. It was Jake, or at least, it looked like him. He was standing perfectly still, just staring at us. "Jake!" I shouted, but Eric grabbed my arm. "No," he said, his voice firm. "That's not Jake. Whatever that is, it's not him." I knew he was right. We stumbled through the woods, barely able to see, our breaths coming out in ragged gasps. The whispering followed us, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was all around us, surrounding us. And then we saw the cabin. It was old, barely standing, hidden between the trees like it had been waiting for us. The windows were shattered, the wood rotting, but there was something about it that made me stop in my tracks. "What the hell is that doing here?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. "This place is supposed to be abandoned." "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing, "but it might be our only chance to get out of here." We didn't have much choice. The whispers were getting louder, the darkness pressing in on us. Whatever was out there, it was closing in fast. We ran toward the cabin, stumbling up the rickety steps and pushing the door open. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside, dusty, dark, and filled with a musty smell that made my stomach turn. But at least it felt like some kind of shelter, a momentary reprieve from whatever was hunting us. "We need to barricade the door," Eric said, already shoving a broken chair against it. I helped him, though part of me wondered if it would even matter. Whatever was out there, it didn't seem like something that could be stopped by a door. "Do you think we're safe in here?" Eric asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't want to lie to him. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the back of the cabin, a faint creaking, like something moving. We both froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Slowly, we turned towards the sound, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The back of the cabin was even more decayed, the walls covered in strange, faded symbols that I didn't recognize. And then, we saw it. A figure, standing in the corner. It was tall, its back hunched, its face hidden in the shadows. For a moment, neither of us moved, our bodies frozen in place. But then the figure slowly turned its head, and we saw its eyes, glowing, empty, like two burning coals in the darkness. It took a step toward us, and the floor creaked beneath its weight. "Mark," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is that?" I couldn't answer. I was too terrified to speak, too paralyzed to move. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the fear it was causing. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was deep, ancient, and filled with malice. It echoed in my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. Eric grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We need to get out of here, now." But before we could move, the figure lunged at us, its hand outstretched, fingers like claws. I felt the air around us grow colder, the light from our flashlights flickering. And then, everything went black. Have you ever felt like you're being watched? That moment when you're alone, but something feels off? Let me know in the comments below if you've ever had a paranormal experience like that. And if you haven't already, hit that like button if you're enjoying the story so far. Trust me, things are about to get even more intense. I woke up to the sound of Eric's voice, panicked, shaky, calling my name from somewhere in the darkness. "Mark, Mark, wake up." My head was throbbing, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. But then it all came rushing back. The woods, the figure, the cabin, whatever had just happened. My eyes shot open, and I was met with total darkness. The flashlight must have died when everything went black. "Eric," I called out, my voice hoarse. "Over here." Eric's voice was coming from the far corner of the cabin. I scrambled to my feet, still dizzy from whatever had knocked me out. My hands felt around in the dark until they landed on Eric's arm. He was trembling, his breath coming out in short, shallow gasps. "What happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. One minute, that thing was coming at us. The next, everything went black. I thought I was dead, man. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still in danger. The figure hadn't just disappeared. I knew it was still out there, somewhere. Watching, waiting. "We need to get out of this cabin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." Eric didn't argue. We moved slowly toward the door, the cabin creaking around us with every step. The whispering had stopped, but there was an eerie silence hanging in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, a loud thud echoed from outside. Both of us froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eric nodded, his face pale in the darkness. The thudding sound came again. "Mark, what if it's still out there?" Eric's voice was trembling. I swallowed hard, gripping the door handle tighter. We couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever it was to come inside. We had to make a run for it, get back to the path, if the path was even still there. "I'm going to open the door," I whispered. "When I do, we run. No looking back, no stopping. Got it?" Eric nodded, though I could see the terror in his eyes. I took a deep breath and counted to 3 in my head. 1, 2. Before I could reach 3, the door swung open on its own. Standing in the doorway was the figure. Its face was still twisted, the empty eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, blocking our only exit. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder by the second. My breath came out in visible puffs as panic surged through me. "Run!" Eric screamed, shoving me aside and bolting toward the back of the cabin. I stumbled after him, my mind racing, every instinct telling me to get as far away from that thing as possible. We darted through the narrow hallway at the back, where the rotting walls seemed to close in on us. Eric was ahead of me, frantically pushing open a door that led to a tiny, dilapidated kitchen. "In here!" he shouted, pulling me inside. We slammed the door behind us, but we both knew it wouldn't hold for long. The cabin was falling apart. Any solid push and that figure would break through easily. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, but my mind was racing. We couldn't stay trapped in this room. There had to be another way out. "The window," I whispered, pointing to a small grimy window near the sink. Eric rushed over and tried to open it, but it was stuck, sealed shut from years of neglect. "Help me," he grunted, using his shoulder to push against the frame. I ran over, putting all my weight into it. For a second, it didn't budge, but then, with a loud creak, the window popped open, a gust of freezing air blowing into the room. The opening was barely big enough to crawl through, but it was our only chance. "You first," Eric urged, his eyes darting toward the door as it started to rattle. I didn't argue. I pulled myself up and through the window, landing outside in the thick mud. The air was freezing, biting into my skin, but I didn't care. We were out, at least for now. Eric followed, grunting as he squeezed through the narrow frame. As soon as his feet hit the ground, we both took off, sprinting away from the cabin as fast as we could. The cold, wet ground slowed us down, but we didn't stop. We didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, we finally stopped to catch our breath, leaning against a tree. The fog was still thick, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. "I think we lost it," Eric panted, though his voice was shaky. I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The woods were too quiet, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just silence. And then I saw it. Off in the distance, barely visible through the fog, was the cabin. But this time, it was different. There was a light in one of the windows, faint, flickering, but unmistakable. "Eric, look." He followed my gaze, his face going pale. "What the hell? How is that possible? We just ran for miles." But there it was. The cabin, exactly the same, as if we'd never left. Before we could react, the light in the window went out, and the door. The door slowly creaked open, as if inviting us back inside. "This can't be happening," Eric muttered, backing away. "This isn't real. It can't be." But it was. The cabin was there, waiting for us, like it had been all along. I don't know what possessed me to take a step toward it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the whispers still lingering in my mind. But before I could get any closer, Eric grabbed my arm. "No way, man, we're not going back. I don't care what that thing is. We need to get out of these woods, now." I nodded, though something inside me told me it wouldn't be that easy. We started walking again, moving quickly, trying to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. But no matter how far we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just going in circles. The trees all looked the same, The fog never lifted, and the air grew colder with every step. It was like the forest itself was alive, twisting and shifting to keep us trapped. And then I heard it, the whispering, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. Mark, Eric. It was the voice again, not Jake's, not anyone's, just something old, something hungry. You shouldn't have come here. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, standing there, watching us. But all I could see was fog, thick and heavy, swallowing up the path behind us. And then, we saw it. Up ahead, the cabin. Again, Eric stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale and drenched with sweat. This is impossible. We've been running in the opposite direction for hours. I didn't have any answers for him. My mind was racing, but all I could think was one thing: we were trapped. We need to find the path again, I muttered, mostly to myself, trying to cling to some shred of logic, but logic didn't seem to apply here. Suddenly, Eric's voice broke through the silence. Mark, there's something in the window. I turned to look, and there it was. The faint glow from the cabin window, and inside, a silhouette. Someone, no, something, was standing there, watching us. We're not going back, I said firmly, grabbing Eric by the arm. Let's go, now. But just as I was about to pull him away, the door of the cabin creaked open. The light from inside flickered out, and the darkness spilled out like a living thing, creeping toward us. That was when I heard the voice again. Come inside. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, deliberate, and it chilled me to the bone. Eric, we need to... Before I could finish my sentence, Eric let out a scream. I turned just in time to see him fall to his knees, clutching his head, his face twisted in agony. It's in my head, Mark. It's in my head. I dropped to his side, trying to pull him to his feet, but he was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide with terror. And then, he stopped. Eric looked up at me, his expression suddenly calm, too calm. It's okay, Mark, he said, his voice eerily flat. I know the way out now. We just have to go back. What? No, Eric. We can't go back to the cabin. We need to keep moving. But before I could finish, Eric stood up, turned toward the cabin, and started walking, like he was in a trance. Eric, stop! I shouted, grabbing his arm, but it was like trying to stop a boulder from rolling downhill. He kept moving forward, his steps slow and steady, as if he was being pulled by some invisible force. Eric, don't do this. But he didn't respond. He just kept walking toward the cabin, disappearing into the fog. And that's when I realized I was alone. I could still hear the whispers all around me, but they were getting louder now, more insistent. Come inside. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing with fear. What was I supposed to do? Go after Eric? Try to find my own way out? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but deep down, I knew there was no escape. Because the cabin wasn't just a place. It was the woods themselves. And now, it had us. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone, my last connection to the outside world. I don't know why I thought it would work, but I had to try something, anything. But as I looked at the screen, I realized there was a message waiting for me, one that hadn't been there before. You can't leave. And then the screen went black. Now that you've followed the story this far, I've got to ask, what do you think Eric saw? Was it all in his head? Or was something out there, leading us deeper into the woods? Leave your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to find out what happens next. Because in these woods, the story's far from over.